From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead, a detailed look at the just-released Kansas Net Farm Income Report for 2018 from the Kansas Farm Management Association here at K-State. This report widely regarded as an important indicator of the economic health of production agriculture in the state. This year, it shows a notable improvement in average net farm income, but with a major caveat. Joining us for this conversation, the KFMA's Kevin Herbel, Jordan Steele, Lindsay Bryant, Trenton Hargrave, Clay Simons, Craig Althauser, and Dillon Rapp. And later, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton talks about delayed planting of tomato and pepper transplants and the option of growing those in containers. All that coming up on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to Agriculture Today. Well, we're going to share with you during our broadcast today what we consider annually as a very important gauge of the economic state of the Kansas farm and ranch economy. The Kansas Farm Management Association has just issued its Summary of Net Farm Income for 2018, based on the records and performance of hundreds of farms that are enrolled in the KFMA all around Kansas. This is important information, and we brought in today the Executive Director of the KFMA, Kevin Herbel, and 6 of the KFMA economists stationed throughout the state of Kansas. They've all been in Manhattan analyzing the numbers and discerning what they have to say about the economic condition of Kansas agriculture. Kevin, we'll turn to you first before we bring the area folk in here. Just explain to those not familiar with the KFMA and this report what it represents, if you would.
Certainly, Eric. What we have with KFMA are a group of farm families around the state of Kansas that have chosen to be members of the Kansas Farm Management Association program. We work together with them to help them manage their records, put together records in an order that they can use for tax planning, for management information to make better decisions on the farm. And a part of their membership agreement is they agree to allow their records to go into a database that's used for research and also used to publish some data that can be used for benchmarks and comparisons by farms all over the state.
Each year, the numbers are pulled together from the records, and you come up with benchmarks, if you will, that indicate where things stand economically for farms and ranches. And one of the more important ones would be that net farm income number. Share what that has to say this year.
Well, as we look at the income for the state, certainly we're bringing in lots of factors, many pulling many different directions as we look at what the income is for 2018. The final net farm income is right at $100,000 for a group of a little over 1,000 farms around the state, some from each of the 6 different associations. You know, as we look at different activities that affect that income around the state, we certainly had influence of market prices for the commodities that we produce. Our grain prices fell quite substantially during 2018, and that certainly had a role. A part of that coming from some trade war activity and various things of that sort affecting things. We had a lot of items influencing yields, all the way from drought conditions, which were quite substantial, particularly in certain areas of the state. Some areas where some excess moisture had some influence. Had individual farms that may have gone from needing to chop their corn for silage for the purposes of the drought conditions, and not too long later harvested some of the best yields that they've seen on soybeans because of some later moisture that came in. So things all the way from livestock forage program payments to cover some of the influence of the drought, crop insurance, and then also the market facilitation payments that came in to affect certainly the net income situation for many of the farms. Those being paid as a result of the trade activities that the government was taking part in.
Now, you mentioned those latter influences because they're no small part of the picture here. The net farm income average, as you said, just barely over $100,000 statewide. You compare that to 2017, $66,000. Was the difference from 17 to 18 in a fair part such things as government payments, crop insurance, the market facilitation program payments?
Was very much an influencer, a big part of that difference. If we look at that 100,000, and usually we just round all these dollars off. This year, since that comes out to exactly 100,000, in reality, it's 100,014 cents. So we didn't just make up a number there. The amount of income per farm coming from the market facilitation payment across this group of KFMA farms was a little over 37,000. So about 37.5% of the income came from those. If we were to take that amount away, we would have a 63,000 income left. If we put other government payments, which along with that, there would have been some of the livestock forage payments and various things that were a part of things, some ARC and PLC payments, the traditional government payments that are in place right now, all government payments in total were just under 55,000. So over half of our income came from those government payments. An additional amount in crop insurance of about $23,500, or over 23% of the income from crop insurance across the state. So much influence as we look at even discussions that were taking place relative to government programs and where should those go and what's most important to farms. Certainly crop insurance rose to the top of things within that. I think as we look at where those crop insurance payments were greatest, the areas of the state most influenced by the drought, you go to northeast Kansas and 59% of their net income was from crop insurance. Southeast Kansas, where less drought influence, it was less than 10%. And so certainly the impact of decisions being made as our government seeks to work out arrangements with other countries and how our trade policies are set up, the influence that had on our market prices this year, the market facilitation payment certainly coming in to offset that and its influence on our net incomes.
Well, Kevin, we'll give you a breather and bring you back in later for more comments, but we want to dive a little deeper into what the numbers are saying on a region-by-region level. And we'll start with the western third of Kansas, and more directly, the Northwest Association for the KFMA, where Jordan Steele serves as the executive economist. When we look at the Northwest average net farm income for 2018, $113,000, just a shade over that. To what do you attribute that number, Jordan?
Thanks for having me, Eric. Definitely fall crop yields played a big part in that. We planted a lot of corn in northwest Kansas, and it turned out well for us with fall moisture. So definitely fall crop yields on that. Our wheat, we got a lot of hail, so wheat wasn't great. It was just like a 37 to 40 bushel average. After that, the fall crops took off, the ones that survived. If you look at our irrigated yields, they were down. They suffered the most hail damage on the way western third of our counties. Our beef cow enterprises didn't show much hope, so definitely I'm going to leave that to fall crops this year.
Mm-hmm. So weather aside, what management approaches or tactics seem to help your producers do fairly well, if not really well, in 2018?
Definitely focusing on what enterprises to plant and cost. Kevin was talking about cost of production earlier. As far as we're concerned, it's not only your direct costs, but your machinery and labor costs too. We're telling everyone to scrutinize all costs.
Would you say that your producers are in a fairly solid state financially right now then, because there have been some lean years in recent times too?
Yes, there has been very lean years. In 15 and 16, we showed zero net farm income basically. The last 2 years at this $100,000 net farm income has improved our financial stability, but if you look at our liquidity and our current ratio is still very poor, only 1.79 on the current ratio, meaning we still have, there's income around, but there's still no cash flow. So the cash flow is still being absorbed by family living and debt payments. So
your producers still need to batten down the hatches financially, be very careful about debt management in particular.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The cash flow, it's a little different trying to explain to them that, yes, we're making money, but there's no cash flow, and that's what seems to be hard to explain to everyone.
Let's turn to your colleague in southwest Kansas. Lindsay Bryant is an economist with the KFMA there. Lindsay, for the southwest part of the state, well, actually, when you look at the average net farm income, it is the champion this year at $181,000, and just a slight bit over that. Would you characterize how things went for your producers, given that impressive figure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to kind of overview on our summary, one thing I do kind of want to point out is due to fewer staff in the office this year, we do have fewer farms in. So we do have kind of a different mix of farms than we have in prior years, and more larger farms with fewer kind of average size farms to kind of bring some of that down a little bit. So we are seeing some difference compared to 17 there with just what we have in. So there are several factors that are contributing to that. First of all, just that different farm mix that we have in there. We do have more cattle in there. That the livestock value produced is $172,000 this year, where it was $79,000 last year. So part of that is from people doing well. Part of that is just from the farms that we do have included. And a large chunk of that is from a custom feeding. That's one factor contributing to that. The government payments is another, as Kevin discussed. Around $117,000 this year, where we were about $57,000 last year. And then also, like Jordan said, our area also had the good yields in the fall crops that it looked pretty daunting there for a while, and then we got that later moisture, which really gave people some above average yields when they were expecting kind of a disaster situation. So all of that combined gives us that number, which is really deceitful, like Jordan said, compared to, the cash flow. Like, there is a cash flow issue.
So how would you describe the comfort level of your producers, economically speaking, then?
I wouldn't say anybody's comfortable at all. With the prices the way they are, no one's necessarily comfortable. So, and I do think we see people pulling back on the cost just because they know what that price is, despite, the MFP payment and stuff like that coming in.
We are going to take a break, and we're going to talk more about the Kansas Farm Management Association numbers and the just-released net farm income summary out of the KFMA with more of the area economists, and once again with Kevin Herbel. After we return, you're listening to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now as we're offering a quick overview of new numbers just released by the Kansas Farm Management Association here at Kansas State University on net farm income in 2018 on Kansas farms and ranches based on the records of membership in the KFMA. And we're going point by point around the state now, talking with the area economists serving the association and working with producers. In north central Kansas, Trenton Hargrave is one of the economists who does that very thing. And Trenton, when we look at the average net farm income number for north central Kansas this past year, it was one of the lower numbers amidst all of those around the state at just shy of $79,000 average net farm income. So times could have been better for your producers, to put it that way?
Yes, definitely had some drought issues. Wheat yields weren't very good, and being in north central Kansas, wheat is a predominant crop. Also had a very large area that had not near what their average corn yields are. There was a lot of chopped corn that didn't even ton out very good, so weren't able to recoup much of their income off silage. One thing that did help make it not as bad as it could have been was the record soybean yields that we saw. There were some areas that had very, very high soybean yields. And with that brought in the good MFP program payments, which weren't quite half of our net farm income, but were close to half of our net farm income.
Now, in your area, you have an appreciable amount of livestock production, cow-calf production in particular. Did that, on those diversified operations, help to stem the tide, if you will?
It didn't appear so with the drought. That also caused feed costs to jump up on those livestock operations. Towards the end, with the rain and the mud, it didn't help with the gains on the cattle either. So feeder cattle operations didn't do quite as good. Feed costs were high on feed purchase throughout the year. So it just feed costs and weather conditions help keep the livestock from really adding much value to our farms.
So as you've worked with your producers, what is the tone of things out there? They obviously have some economic challenges before them. Grain prices clearly have not improved much. Mm-hmm. How are things looking?
For the most part, everybody's keeping their head above water, having some have issues, but I think that's the case no matter what time you're in. Unless things are just as good as they were 5-10 years ago, there's always going to be some guys having issues, but for the most part, our numbers don't look too bad. But it's just kind of everybody's worried about, we made it by this year, but what will next year bring? That's just been the tone for the last few years is, we made it through this year, but it doesn't look promising going forward.
So in terms of their management, they're going to try to be even more conservative in how they approach things? Yeah,
and that would be one positive thing that I did see was our expenses were down about $15,000 last year. So that was one thing that farmers can control. They can't control the weather that would affect their yields, but they can control their expenses. So seeing expenses down $15,000, I don't know how long we can keep that up, and I don't know how much tighter we can make that number.
Let's talk with your counterpart in South Central Kansas, Clay Simons, the executive economist there. So, Clay, in the south central part of the state, quite an improvement over 2017's numbers, 32,000 in 17, 103,000, nearing 104,000 for an average net farm income in 2018. So what was the catalyst behind that?
Just like everybody else has been saying, our wheat yields and our dryland corn yields especially were down, but those August rains really came in and helped milo yields, and a lot of our producers had, just tremendous soybean yields out there. Our average through the Association for Soybeans was about 43 bushels an acre, which in a lot of years, if you're approaching 30 in South Central Kansas, you're really knocking the ball out of the park. And so with that, we had higher market facilitation payments. Our average producer had almost $35,000 in those market facilitation payments, so that's a third of your profit right there. And so it's just those fall crop yields and market facilitation payments really made a huge difference.
What are producers doing differently in a management sense that may have lent to this number as well?
Oh, again, like everybody else, they're trying to keep a close eye on cost. We've had our fair share of struggles. You said we were up significantly over 17, but in 16 and 15, we had negative net farm incomes in those years. And so it's allowed some folks to heal up, but, it seems like one of the big differences, because we've still got plenty of members in our association that are struggling financially, our bottom 25%, their net farm income was a $27,000 loss. So we have plenty of people struggling. People are keeping an eye on cash flow. But in a lot of ways, it seems like the difference between those producers that are doing better now than when compared to others that are maybe struggling a little bit more, it's how they have been managing their debt back before things really turned bad. I think that's been very much a key to the difference between how farms have been doing financially across the board.
Right, Clay and Trenton, thanks for the overview of the KFMA report for the central part of the state. And rounding out this segment, how things fared in the eastern third of Kansas. Craig Althauser is the executive economist in the northeast part of the state. Craig, there's no getting around it. It was an awfully rough year in the Northeast economically in 2018, and that's depicted in the average net farm income number for the Northeast. $57,500. That is the lowest comparing to the other numbers in the state. It's largely, you say, about drought and a huge impact on crop production.
That's right, Eric. That really drove our numbers. In 2018, extreme drought didn't impact the entire area in our Northeast Association. It did impact enough to have a strong result on yields. We had the lowest corn yield in association-wide since 2011. While we did have some areas with very good bean yields due to some moisture that did eventually arrive in parts of our association, across the entire association as an average, it wasn't strong enough to offset what the drought had impacted. to the association.
And if one looks back over the last few years, the average net farm income for Northeast Kansas, coming off of a tremendous year in 2014, $152,000, 15 was in the red, 16 and 17, quite similar to what happened in 18, around that $50,000 mark or so. Is there a disturbing trend here, Craig?
That's well said, Eric, and that's our concern. Frankly, we're concerned at the persistence of these economic conditions where we're not making a lot of progress. We're not building net worth. We're actually suffering a little bit there, and also cash flow is becoming a serious issue on a lot of farms. That average current ratio for our operations has dropped from about 3.3 in 2014, before these last 4 years of tough times, to essentially 2.3 last year. And while that's not a horrible number, the trend is concerning, very concerning.
Let's bring in your associate from southeast Kansas. Dillon Rapp is an economist with the KFMA there. This is a better picture, Dillon, to be honest, compared to what Craig has been citing here from northeast Kansas. Your average net farm income, $129,000, almost $130,000 in 2018. What do you chalk that up to as a much better scenario than the previous year, which was right around $105,000?
Well, it looks really bright on the surface, Eric, but once we kind of dive into the numbers here, it's similar to what a lot of the other areas around the state are saying, in that the MFP payments are really our difference in the increase in income. We saw roughly a $27,000 increase from where we were at in 2017, but we had $45,000 worth of MFP payments. So you take that out, and we're at $85,000, down from the little over $100,000 we were at the past 2 years, and it's the lowest we've seen since 2015. And the story is a lot different than it is with what the numbers are showing. So it made a significant impact on our net farm incomes for sure.
That considered what's going right on the management side on the farm and ranch down there to add to the positives of the support payment.
Right. We did have very strong bean yields. Corn yields were slightly down, but not near the drought impact they saw up in the northeast part of the state that Craig was just talking about. We saw some impacts of that in kind of our northern part of the southeast area. Our corn was down around 20 bushel from where it was the year before, but didn't see much in the way of crop insurance. But, like we have the past 2 years, we made really good beans in southeast Kansas, and those soybeans paid $1.65 a bushel for every bushel of those. So that was a big impact.
So, Dillon, how would you rate the economic status of your producers as we roll through 2019 now?
We've been pretty fortunate the last few years and been able to kind of produce our way through these problems, but similar to what Craig was saying, we're kind of one bad year from a big issue here. We've seen our financial position continue to worsen despite a fairly strong profitability the last few years. Our current ratio continues to trend downward. Debt to asset ratios continue to trend upward, and our overall debt level continues to increase. And we saw a fairly substantial increase in our interest expense this last year, just from the impact of an increasing rate environment. So if that continues to turn that direction, that could become an issue in the future too.
Well, thanks to all of our area economists for the interpretations of their numbers from this new KFMA report. When we return, we'll have some summary thoughts from the Kansas Farm Management Association's Kevin Herbel about what trends we see from these numbers and what this portends for agricultural returns to producers in 2019. That's ahead on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson back with you. And once again, concluding our conversation about this new report that has just been released by the Kansas Farm Management Association out of Kansas State University. It's the annual Net Farm Income Summary for 2018. Kevin Herbel is back with us, who is the Executive Director of the Farm Management Association. Kevin, wanted to ask you to share some common threads you are hearing from the discussions from our area economists earlier on where things stand as far as our agricultural income here in Kansas. And one thing that was ringingly clear, crop insurance, government payments, but most assuredly that market facilitation program, which was instituted one time in 2018. Absent those, the returns picture for our producers is starkly different than what otherwise might be interpreted here.
That is certainly the case. It looks quite different if we were to take that out of the position and even just looking at the fact that we begin 2019 in a position with market prices that are quite a bit lower than what we had going into 2018. So we already know we're beginning at a lower point. Expectation that we would not be receiving a payment such as we did with the market facilitation payment in this coming year. And I think a lot of that leads to the situation we have where while we're showing net incomes that look pretty good based on recent history. You know, you go back to the really good years of 2014 and prior to have incomes similar to some of what we're seeing, not in all associations, but in a number of them. And yet at the same time, a very consistent communication of the comfort level not being real strong amongst the farms that are participating in KFMA and amongst farm families around the state of Kansas. A lot of things we can see as we look at management decisions that have been made in recent years. The machinery investment per crop acre across all of our farms is down about $20 per acre 5 years ago to today. So there's a tightening of input from that standpoint. But decision-making relative to direction to be taken is still being tempered by this tight economic environment. Our debt levels, average debt per farm went from about $616,000 at the start of the year to $644,000 at the end of the year. So an increased level of debt. The debt to asset remained right at about 23% from beginning of year to end of year. Our current financial position did improve just slightly, but not enough to say is noticeable as we went from 2.17 to 2.22. But if we look at this group of farms and even divide them into quartiles, there's some farms that are looking at 2019 and likely have a little stronger comfort level in looking at the year. One of the things we'll often discuss when we look at current financial position is the working capital level. Now, working capital just in itself, not a good measure to compare between farms or even assess where a given farm is at. But if we look at a ratio utilizing working capital, and one that we like to look at is working capital related to operating expense plus interest. So we're looking at what they have in resources that can be readily turned to cash in the next year, and how does that compare to what they had for operating expense and interest expense in the last year. And that can give us a feel for what is the strength of that current position of that farm. Our top 25% farms are just over 100%. So they have in inventories. Now, some of those as of the first of the year were inventories not yet sold that may have ended up being sold at a lesser price, but a very strong current position for those farms. Our bottom 25% farms at less than 30%. So those farms with the availability of inventories and cash to not get a third of the way through the year. And for most of our farms around the state, a third of the year doesn't bring us to our next influx of income to come in. We're also looking at farms having less acres of wheat. So in many instances, even with potential for pretty good yields, those wheat acres are down. And with where our prices have gone on the wheat, we're looking at a good share of the farms not having a large amount of income to come in for quite a while. And that tight financial position doesn't appear that it would go away in any short order. So a need to continue to manage in that tight economic time is very important. And so we've kind of maybe gained from a lot of what everyone's been saying here today that maybe could say that the net income is somewhat deceiving in what it communicates to us.
Looks can be deceiving.
Yes,
that is certainly the case here.
And certainly for each individual farm, knowing and understanding their position in a way that they aren't deceived by what they see at a given point in time, and rather are prepared for what they're looking at in the year ahead and for the steps that they need to be taking to put themselves in a solid position for the successful profitability of their farm in the years ahead.
Want to ask you one final thing here, and not to dwell on the negative, but one has to wonder, given how farm equity in a general vein has been hampered in recent years, how many more body blows can equity take as we look through the balance of this year and maybe beyond before things really get dicey for producers out there?
Well, one of the things that's helped us out a lot is the fact that land prices have remained relatively strong. One certainly has to wonder, how long can those land prices remain at the levels they have? When will we start to see a downturn? Looking back to the 80s, everything was somewhat delayed. So we had the downturn of the economic environment, downturn of incomes. While it was in the early 80s that we began to see problems develop, it was the mid-'80s that those problems really began to come home to roost for the farms that were influenced by it. And even while we may look and say the average here looks pretty good, we've still got 21% of our farms in 2018 that had a negative net farm income. We'd add another 26% that were under $50,000 at a level under family living expense for most families. Nearly half of our farms are at that point. And so with that in mind, I think a lot of need to be managing very critically those things that are in the areas where a farm manager can make decisions and be able to exert an influence in a positive way for their own farm and their own farm family's future.
Well, for anyone who would like to have a look at the executive summary of this year's Net Farm Income Report, it will soon be available to you online at the agmanager.info website. It'll detail everything that we've discussed today and much more at agmanager.info. And, of course, Kevin, you and your team will be dissecting the numbers even further. We'll have you back in soon to talk about such things as the enterprise analysis, breaking the numbers down that way, and other ways of glancing at what this report has to say. Until that time, many thanks to you and your crew for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric.
Kevin Herbel with us there. He is the Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Management Association. And again, earlier, KFMA area economists Jordan Steele, Lindsay Bryant, Trenton Hargrave, Clay Simons, Craig Althauser, and Dillon Rapp, reviewing what these new numbers say about the condition of the Kansas agricultural economy. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
For you now on Agriculture Today, our weekly segment on horticulture, and directly this time around to vegetable gardening, which has been brought to something of a crawl lately because of our excessively wet weather in many parts of Kansas. And that is part of our theme today as we talk with Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent Dennis Patton, joining us from his office in Olathe now, on a couple of matters here, Dennis. One is on warm season vegetable transplants, those highly popular tomatoes, peppers, and the like. Folks haven't had much of a chance to get those out in the garden of late, and that brings up some questions on how much latitude do they have time-wise to get those crops going.
Well, you know what? We're not really in panic mode at this point in time. You know, traditionally, kind of Mother's Day weekend, which is coming up, is the ideal time to get those tomatoes and warm season crops out in the ground. And so we're still in good shape. Even if we don't get them in the ground for another week, 2 weeks down the road, all's going to be fine. Because the other thing that we have to deal with this year, in addition to the wet soils, is it's just been cool. And, of course, these are warm season crops, so they like those warmer soil temperatures where they really get off and get growing. So, you know, I wouldn't say we're in panic mode yet for our tomato harvest of 2019.
Very good. if one gets a bit over anxious, they have their transplants, they want to get something done, there's some inherent danger in planting in overly wet soils, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a couple things that go wrong. With wet soils, when they're really wet, that means oxygen is excluded from the soil, and that will cause the plants, we call them drowned out. And so those plants that have a weakened root system from the excess moisture are actually probably going to take longer to recover than something we might wait for this weather pattern to leave us and plant a little bit later in the season. So here again, just the wet soils, slow growth. Also, when we work in wet soils, we compact it and we cause maybe longer down the road problems too with those soils getting in there and getting when they're really wet and muddy. So, maybe this is a good time to sit back, relax, or maybe do a little bit more shopping and just kind of wait for this weather pattern to clear out.
Exact some patience. Now, if one has already purchased transplants, say a week, 2 weeks ago, waiting for that opportunity, what do they need to do, if anything, to maintain those transplants in a relatively healthy state before they can get out in the garden with them?
Well, first, have you taken a peek at my patio when you asked that question?
Nope. You're in that situation.
Oh, my gosh, yes. My plant nursery is doing just fine. My tomato, my pepper plants are sitting there like everyone else's, and I'm just keeping them well watered. I've got them in good sunlight, but maybe not the hottest broiling afternoon so they don't dry out in those little packs real quickly. And then if I'm going to have them too much longer, I'll probably just mix up houseplant fertilizer that I use in my houseplants and water with them once a week or so just to keep good nutrition up in those plants. And then once the soil breaks, dries out, I'll get them in the ground. So, yeah, in those containers you can hold them, but you try not to stress them with too much dryness, or then maybe here again feed them, and they should be fine to hold for a couple weeks more.
So they will keep for a while. And that transitions nicely into an option if one is so inclined, or if they are short of actual garden space. These very vegetables can be grown successfully in containers throughout the season, can they not, Dennis?
That is correct, and actually we see that as a bigger trend in vegetable gardening to go to containers or some of these fabric-type pots that we fill up with a good quality potting mix, potting soil, then that has excellent drainage, holds good water, but you can get in there and work when we've had the rainy spells like this. And a lot of our vegetable crops, our tomatoes, peppers, work well in containers, and especially some of our tomatoes are getting smaller as more and more the trend nationwide is for smaller plants that work better in containers on decks, patios, apartments, those type of things. I think for a nice tomato plant, the smallest size pot, probably, I'm going to use a 5-gallon bucket range because that's what a lot of people can visualize. But if you want to do a big slicer, maybe you can go up to a pot that may be 10-gallon in size, so you have enough soil mass to grow a big, massive plant.
Now, when you talk about those larger gallon pots, one must understand that if they have some intentions of moving those around later in the season, as those plants grow, those become pretty heavy. So duly note that.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, I use the term 5-gallon bucket, which will work, but make sure you drill some holes in them because you've got to make sure you have excellent drainage. And the other thing I talked about real briefly was just the potting mix. We're not going to put dirt from the garden, soil from the garden in those containers. We're going to buy a commercially prepared potting mix that for the most part is soilless but provides that good drainage, aeration that we need for success. You put our heavy clay soils in a pot and you kind of create this little bog effect that is not going to really be advantageous to a healthy plant.
Beyond that soil medium and making sure you go the right direction there, what are some other tips and tricks to succeeding with container gardening, or in this case, container-grown tomatoes or peppers?
Well, container gardening is really no different than growing it in the ground, except you're growing in a pot or a container. So here again, tomatoes, peppers, they're going to need full sun, so at least probably 6 hours of sunlight a day. So unfortunately, if your deck patio is on the north side of a house, you may not have enough sun. The other trick is these plants you're watering a lot because in the container they dry out rapidly. And they're going to have to make sure you watch that fertility, that nutrition level. So get on some sort of regular feeding schedule. I made a comment a few minutes ago about just using your houseplant fertilizers. Those work great. But just some sort of a fertilizer that takes you throughout the entire season, because, we get great tomato harvests in September, and we don't want to stop short fertilizing. We want to make sure we push those plants all summer long so we get good fruit production until frost.
Now, that commercial soil medium one can purchase will often contain nutrients in and of itself, but you're talking about supplemental nutrients beyond that, right?
That is correct. Yeah, a lot of those soil mixes have a slow-release fertilizer in them. But what I've read and always learned through extension is that those last, the 3 to 6 months, like on the label, under ideal conditions, which are much cooler soil conditions, but under the warm, hot conditions of a Kansas summer, those fertilizers can maybe only last half as long as it's stated on the bag. So let's say you buy a product that says feed your plants for 3 months. If it's outdoors in Kansas, I'd put that more down at a month and a half, and then I'd start feeding those plants to get us through the season.
All right. But once again, if you'd like to, go ahead and place the vegetable transplants you purchased in containers, and then you can make a decision whether you're going to stick with them in those containers or move them eventually out into your gardening area. But it is an option worth looking into. Dennis, as always, thanks for the comments.
It's been a pleasure.
That from Johnson County Extension Horticultural Agent Dennis Patton on this week's Horticulture segment. That'll do it for our Thursday edition. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.